House shall come to order.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah!
The motion that stands before the House this evening is that this House believes Reform UK will win the next general election. And we are joined by some excellent speakers tonight. We have Miya Turner and Abbie Lewis on the proposition, and Alexandros, Avramidis and Iain McGrigor on the opposition. Before we begin the debate, I would like to invite the clerk to read last week's minutes in the style of Nigel Farage.
Look, I've been saying it for years. Nobody wants to listen to these minutes. The establishment, the so-called elites of this society, they want to force-feed you every tedious word from last week's proceedings. While I say enough is enough, let's get these minutes done.
But Nigel, we need to know what happened last week.
Fine, but we'll do it down at the pub with a pint.
There seems to be some disagreement in the House. I will have to take a vote by oral acclamation. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read say aye.
Aye.
And all those against say nay.
Nay.
It seems rather close. I'll have to consult my sergeant.
Resign.
Fantastic.
Resign.
Don't tempt me. Without any further ado, the minutes are taken as read, and I give the call to the first proposition speaker to give their address and start the case for proposition Ben. Here.
I do not like Reform, I do not like their policies, and I do not like their style of politics, and I do not like the people who represent them. But unfortunately, I'm not representative of the majority of Britons. What is Reform? Reform is a far-right party headed by Nigel Farage that came about after the Brexit referendum and has grown in prominence in British political landscape ever since. Let's start this debate by explaining what the polls say about Reform UK. So a September 2025 MRP poll conducted by YouGov found the Reform government was a near certainty if the election was to be held today. MRP polls, or multi-level regression and post-stratification polls, combine traditional polls with large data sets like census information, which enables us to more effectively characterise what the differences in constituency voting is likely to look like. This makes polling conducted in this manner significantly more effective. For example, ahead of the 2024 election, the MRP polls conducted by YouGov called 92% of constituencies correctly. I want to note also a phenomenon known as the shy voter effect means that the polls are likely underestimating the success of Reform UK. This is an effect by which individuals who have an incentive to vote for far-right or populist parties underrepresent how often they are going to do this because they are afraid of the social pushback that comes from admitting this. This is the reason why in the 2016 and 2020 American elections, the success of Donald Trump was underestimated. So if opposition want to stand up and tell you that the polls are inaccurate, maybe they are, but they're likely inaccurate in a way which means they're actually underestimating the success of the Reform Party rather than overestimating it. Additionally, polling companies just learn from the past polling that they've conducted. So YouGov has noted several lessons they've learned from the 2024 polling. What I've just proven then is that polls are showing that Reform are going to win the next election in 2029. The polls are currently highly accurate and that they are consistently improving. Even if you believe the polls are inaccurate, seeing that Reform are predicted to win makes it more likely that they will. When people can see polling which suggests that Reform are likely going to take the next election, it means that individuals who are opposed to Reform are less likely to come out and vote or campaign because they feel resigned to the nature of a Reform victory. Comparatively, individuals who support Reform are even more emboldened. The intuition here is simply to look at the last election, whereby bad polling by the Conservatives meant that Conservative voters stayed home or chose to vote for other parties, whereas the same bad polling emboldened Labour supporters to go out and vote in larger numbers, largely because they wanted to be a part of this historic landslide victory. Let me explain then why Reform policies appeal to a large number of British voters. 3 reasons here. Firstly, policies on immigration suggested by Reform provide easy answers to people's complicated issues. So when people in the UK cannot access healthcare treatment easily, when the children's schools are underfunded, when their roads are crumbling, they don't want to hear that this is because of shifting population pyramids that have changed taxable assets, high government debt accumulated since the collapse of Bretton Woods and the financial crises of the 90s and 2000s, or the destruction of British manufacturing initiated by the growth of the Indian economy or the policies of Danish China. They want easy answers, and this is exactly what reform provides them with their demonisation of immigrant communities. Opposition might say that this desire to simplify issues exists for all political parties, and they would be right, but as soon as traditional establishment parties like Labour or the Conservatives also talk about why immigrants are to blame for the country's problems, they move the Overton window in British political discussions to be a situation in which all parties agree that immigrants are the problem, but now only reform, is suggesting the policies that people actually want to hear to order to tackle that issue. So insofar as any argument from the opposition about why other parties are also opting into this narrative just means that you're going to see more of a reform victory. You can't out-reform reform on immigration. This is a land in which they're always going to win. Second reason why their policies appeal to individuals is because many voters just have bought racist and Islamophobic narratives about immigrants. See conversations around the justifications for Brexit, the Southport riots, or attacks on migrant housing. The British political landscape shows clear evidence that many voters just are racist. They actively like the racist opinions expressed by Farage, Tice, and councillors like Sarah Potchin, who recently criticised adverts that show non-white families, so they actively buy into this sort of narrative when it's pushed by reform. Thirdly, reform are arguing against what many people see as frivolous spending. So suggested cuts to things like net zero, foreign aid, or disability benefits plays well to a population who believe that these are the kinds of spending performances which mean that they're not able to access things like healthcare, not able to have good spending on things like schools. I want to note, the fact that reform has never been in government makes them appear more ideologically pure on these issues than any other party. So even if the Conservatives or Labour suggest they're going to make similar cuts to disability benefits, they are never going to be able to attract the same number of voters that reform are, because reform is always going to be able to point to cherry-picked examples from these establishment parties to suggest that they are the reason why these issues exist. Reform can present themselves as a new party, one that is not tainted by this past and is able then to be more successful moving forward. What policies are Labour going to have to introduce, and why are they just going to benefit reform when they are introduced? Firstly, Labour are going to have to raise taxes in the autumn budget. This is likely going to look like raising inheritance tax and capital gains tax, because these are two taxes that Labour has not completely ruled out raising in their manifesto. People don't like paying high taxes, and they're going to start looking for alternative political representation as soon as taxes get too high. I'm going to explain later in my speech why reform will be the only option for right-wing voters who want to see taxes cut in the next election. Second reason why Labour are going to fail is because they're going to have to make real-time cuts to goods and services. This is likely going to happen because the government just can't afford to increase funding in line with inflation, because they can't raise enough money from taxes as a result of promises made in their manifesto, and because they've already committed to increases in defence spending, and are going to have to make significant payments on debt repayments, which means that they're just not going to have that large amount of money. This means we're going to see cuts to healthcare treatment, to clinical services like histocompatibility, to education and to council services. This pushes more people into a disenfranchised majority insofar as it makes more individuals feel as though the traditional political establishment is not representing them, thus pushing them more in line with reform. I want to note, if opposition tell me, oh, Labour aren't going to cut healthcare because that would be really bad for their polling, they don't have to. They just have to mean it, that they just don't have to increase the funding for these particular forms of social spending in line with inflation in order to get those real-time cuts. So people's quality of ability to access these services is going to meaningfully decrease. Third thing Labour are going to do is they're going to introduce policies that actively play into reforms as sort of campaigning. So things like identification cards are actively playing into the reform ideology that the political establishment seeks to undermine the rights of individuals in Britain rather than giving them more freedoms. So this actively benefits reform insofar as it enables them to align themselves with this sort of campaigning. What do Labour voters do in response to the implementation of these policies? Firstly, they just leave for another progressive party. So when Labour voters can see that Labour no longer has the ability to do things like nationalise key services or spend on social services because they don't have enough money from taxation, they just move to parties like your party or the Greens, who are suggesting alternative ways to fund this money. Thus they split the Liberal vote, which I'm going to explain is so damaging in a few minutes. Or secondly, they just become so disillusioned that they stop voting or they stop campaigning, and all of this makes it significantly more likely that the Liberal vote is going to be split in such a way that benefits reform. Why then is the left-wing vote going to be split moving into the next election? Left-wing voters in 2029 are going to be split between Labour, the SNP, who are predicted to take back nearly all of the seats that they lost to Labour in Scotland, much to my anger, the Greens, who have seen an explosion in membership and popularity since the coming of their new leader Zach Walensky, and your party, who are capturing a lot of the young people who have felt disenfranchised with establishment left-wing politics. This has historically been the case with left-wing politics. The only reason why Labour was able to avoid this dangerous splitting of the progressive vote in 2024 was because the right-wing vote was even more split. Now, let's explain why the right-wing vote is not going to be split in 2029. Literally because the Conservatives are dead in the water. They have lost voters through their just terrible record with 13 years in government and their inability to do anything which is meaningfully capturing that disillusioned majority. But more importantly, they have lost the donors. Donors are the people who enable campaigns to be won and lost, and they have lit simply abandoned the Conservatives. They don't want to back the losing horse anymore. They don't want to back the party who can't spell the word Britain on the merch that they give out at their party political broadcasts. This is not something that the donors are going to want to do. So this means that the Conservatives just won't have the money to fund an effective election campaign in 2029. Now, why are Reform going to be able to have the money to fund this electoral campaign in 2029? 3 reasons here. Firstly, donors are convinced by the polls that Reform are going to win. So this is why the polls become self-fulfilling prophecy. So even if opposition convince you that the polls are inaccurate, the very fact that they are showing that Reform are going to win encourages donors to throw their weight behind Reform. Because you always want to be backing the winning horse in political elections. Because doing so means that you have the ear of the next government. You have the ability to influence policy, and this is something which the donors who come from sort of backgrounds of business really want to have. Additionally, donors specifically want to avoid situations in which there is a hung or minority parliament. So even if all that they can see in the polls is that Reform are going to get a significant number of votes, they want to be giving the money to that party to ensure that a majority government can be reached. Because a majority government is easier to influence, it is less gridlocked, it is more predictable, and that is all good for business. So even if you believe that the polls are inaccurate or are only showing a minority government for Reform, there is still a reason why the donors are going to give money to this party over any others. Secondly, donors are likely the people most affected by the policies that Labour are required to implement. So raises to inheritance or capital gains tax most significantly affect the donors, the people with the money to be able to back the winning parties in the next election. They're going to want to fund a party who opposes these policies with the greatest chance of winning, so they give their money to Reform, rather than the Conservatives who they can see are polling at significantly lower numbers. But thirdly, Reform are very well connected to international right-wing populist movements, which means that they are able to have concerted international funding drives, which means that they're able to get more money. So Reform isn't just able to access funding from British individuals, from British business leaders in the way that other parties are able to, but aligning their messaging with the campaigns of people like Milei in Argentina or Trump in the US means that the Reform are able to access donations from a much wider spectrum of individuals than is the case with any other parties in the UK. And this means that they're going to be able to access more money in order to be able to enable them to access this sort of better campaigning in the next election. So what does this money mean that Reform are able to do? It firstly means that they're able to do really good traditional broadcasting. Think leaflets, paying for people to knock doors, paying for billboards and conventional advertising like party political broadcasts. You cannot underestimate the significance of this. A significant reason why the Conservatives lost the election in 2024 was because they lost the ear of the donors. They didn't have the money to be able to do things like pay for individuals to go out and actively demonstrate that these individuals were able to be good at these parties. The second thing that Reform is able to do with this money is they're able to do really good modern campaigning. So they're able to do things like run really effective social media campaigns, which enables them to capture the interest of the disenfranchised youth. This is something that the Reform Party has a comparative advantage in. Insofar as a lot of their leaders are just really quite funny. And then it is true that Farage is funnier than Keir Starmer is, because Keir Starmer is really boring. So when individuals see videos of Reform posted on social media, they're much more likely to vote for them than any other parties. So to conclude, enjoy your social freedoms and your comparatively efficient and detoxified political landscape, because the next election is going to be won by Reform. Happy Halloween.
I thank the Speaker for their excellent address, and now cross the floor and give the call to the first opposition speaker to begin the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Well, as of last night, my speech is incomplete. Why? Because after Canada, Australia, now the Netherlands have joined the establishment and centre train, with the massively underperforming in the polls Democrat 66 party going from, in the last 3 months, from the fourth party in the polls to coming on top. Ladies and gentlemen, the establishment is striking back all across the Western world. It's a fact. But I'm not going to base this on trends, because they often don't say a lot. In fact, yes, polls are not encouraging. If we were to believe some of the polls that especially Reform are pumping out, we should all go home right now. But then again, given that Reform pumps out a new poll almost every week, you really do have to wonder, do they really have endless amount of money to conduct a new poll? Or is it it's just someone wearing a Nigel Farage football jersey standing in front of a computer deciding how many seats they're going to give themselves for the next election? Now, I know that for modern political standards, no one likes to be compared to Greece. But I hope you won't be offended and hear me out when I say that there's a very valuable comparative to be made here. Why? Because Syriza, the party that ruled Greece from 2015 to 2019, is 100% comparable to Reform, and it stands as the only example in the Western world and in Europe of an anti-establishment party that started from the fringe and ended up in government. Now, let's look at its characteristics. So, number one, I just said it, 2009, in our general election, Syriza polled 4%, 2015, they're up to 36%. They were a party that had no links with the establishment and were only led by a charismatic or semi-charismatic, depending on your viewpoint, leader, Alexis Tsipras. You can see that with Farage in Reform. Finally, Greece has very similar party and political system to the UK, with, up until 2015, two major establishment parties, our equivalent of Conservatives and Labour, that alternated in single-party majority governments. We have very similar electoral thresholds to get an absolute majority. In comparison, Farage and Reform do not make a very good comparative for other right-wing leaders making success right now, like Javier Milei in Argentina, completely different economic and social model, or Donald Trump, as Donald Trump comes with the weight of the full institutional party of the Republican Party that brings a swarm of dedicated voters. Now, let's look at how Syriza got to win the 2015 election. Number one, crisis, crisis, crisis. Three crises. One, deep faith in establishment parties. By 2015, the two parties were cut from 40 and 30% respectively in 2009 to 18 and 4% respectively, the Conservatives and our Socialists. This was, second of all, huge political instability. In 2012, amidst huge economic crisis, the two establishment parties were decimated to end up with a national unity government between our equivalents of Conservatives and Labour to implement a very harsh bailout package. Why was all this necessary? Third and most important, deep economic crisis. By 2015, the Greeks had to endure 5 years of a crippling financial crisis that got us to 25% unemployment. It takes these huge numbers for an electorate to abandon completely the establishment. In comparison, the UK at the moment has under 5% unemployment, but we'll get to that. So, the UK definitely ticks off the first box. I'm not going to deny it. Deep crisis of faith in establishment parties. But how deep is that? In 2024, Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems garnered over 60% of the vote in total. Now, I'm not saying that these three parties could ever form necessarily a national unity government of some sort. I don't think that a Republican barrage like the one we see in France is very possible. But you do see that there is a huge margin there. These three parties, or at least the Conservatives and Labour, need to lose in total about 15 to 20 points for them to stop dominating the political sphere and Reform to come up with an absolute majority. Is this likely? No. The peculiarities of first past the post mean that you need anywhere from 34% to 43% to form a feeble majority or a supermajority. Now, the results of the 2024 election suggest that Reform will always need higher numbers to achieve more, because with 14%, they only managed to get 4 seats. So you see that the 33% that Labour got and got them 400 seats cannot cut it for Reform. And I'm not going to bore you anymore with the very specifics from constituency to constituency. Second of all, political crisis and instability. With a 19 or 12 seat majority, it's very hard to argue that there is major political instability in the UK. The lights are on, things are functioning. Yes, again, deep dissatisfaction, but to argue that there is a political crisis is quite a stretch. And now we get to the third and most important box to tick. Deep, deep economic crisis. Where is it? I'm not saying that the UK's economy is not in trouble. It is. But you're far, far, far from like a thing that we saw in Europe with the Euro debt crisis. And Greece, 25% unemployment that got an anti-establishment party from 4% to 36%. Even if, and I'm going to entertain the proposition here, even if the UK was to hit the bump and go into deep crisis within the next 2 years, what would happen? Well, experience shows that once something like that happens, there is one option followed by Labour governments as well in the 1970s. You're going to go to the IMF for a bailout. That will also come along with deep and hurtful austerity measures. Once this happens, the electorate usually, experience has showed from Europe and the Western world, will split in two. Between the "we need to save the country" coalition, mainly comprising from lower and upper middle class, of educated white-collar workers, who will back any austerity measures in the basis of reason and rational economic policy, and the populist "we need to protect our independence from supranational organizations" and so on and so forth, populists. It's very fair to say that Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dem are going to form the bulk of the austerity coalition, and Reform will be the strongest voice in the anti-austerity coalition. Now, to win the next election, or any election, Reform needs to create a coherent electoral coalition of large enough parts of the anti-establishment vote, which always splits between the far right and the far left, and, as proposition very correctly said, we see a growing anti-establishment vote on the left. And of course, that's not enough. They got them up to 14%. You need something more. What's that something more? Generally speaking, the upper middle class. They are always the last to abandon both the establishment, both the establishment, and they're usually the last to abandon what is generally called rational economic policy. So, from the minute that Farage, which is very, very probable, is going to start opposing things like bailout packages and austerity measures and anything other than economic orthodoxy, these people will not go for him until it starts to sting, which, again, experience shows it's going to take at least 4 to 5 years. In short, yes, Reform might win, especially if these sorts of crises hit, but you're looking at least half a decade of Reform. So really, to argue that Reform is going to win is to argue that such a maelstrom of crises are going to hit the UK that you're not a debater, you're a very, very bad fortune teller. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their excellent address, and now we cross the floor once again and give the call to the second proposition speaker to continue the case for proposition bench. Hear, hear.
Alex and I normally play like example tennis in the privacy of our own home, but for some reason he's decided to bring up Greece, which unfortunately we're not in. I'm just going to throw a couple of examples back at him to prove why the Greece stuff isn't actually that relevant, then deal with the actual what cases we thought were going to come out of opposition, and then sit down and listen to Iain. Okay, so I think there's probably a couple of other examples that we can just throw straight back at Alex. Look at Le Pen in France, look at Meloni in Italy, look at Wilders in the Netherlands. All of these individuals are kind of right-wing populist type of people who are existing within Europe. So if Alex wants to tell you about Greece, I think there's just a bunch of other people who can show that this is quite a realistic and something that is potentially going to happen. So don't buy Alex's, like, I nearly swore then, sorry Ava, don't buy Alex's rubbish options, because I think there are just other reasons. Okay, so first of all I'm going to explain... No, Alex. Christ, get a job. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to do the first bit of preemption that I thought was going to come out of Alex's case, which about like first past the post and stuff like that. Alex just kind of says the phrase first past the post, doesn't explain to you what it looks like, doesn't explain to you as to why Reform are actually going to lose this in a meaningful way. Going to give you a bunch of reasons as to why, first of all, they can get the majority, and second of all, why first past the post is actually the unique system that's going to benefit Reform in a better way. Okay, so I think the first past the post only hurts smaller parties when majority parties are stable, because that's how you get the two-party system where you have Conservative versus Labour flying at the top and all these other parties are left behind. I think there's already a double collapse of these parties that exist within Britain. The Conservatives are losing like a lot of traditional seats. They're fractured over things like immigration policy, leadership, the Brexit legacy that falls behind them, where you've got individuals like Cameron who are more anti, other individuals who are more pro. You've already got all this legacy existing within Conservatives, which means you already have disenfranchised Conservative voters. Second of all is you have disenfranchised Labour voters, where Labour is currently failing to inspire the working class. You're talking to somebody who's from the middle of England, where we had a massive swing towards Labour and an immediate swing back towards Reform and Conservatives, because the working class people there feel as though they aren't being represented by Labour in this kind of way. And I think it probably also just means that Starmer is seen as more centrist. He isn't seen as like this interesting guy. He's seen as relatively uninspiring, which means the more left-leaning people that would currently subscribe to Labour are pulling out of Labour because they don't think that Starmer represents their views. They fail on promises, see things such as like child poverty to things like Gaza. All of these sorts of things Labour is seen to not be doing the things that they promised to do, even though it's only been like a year or so. And I think that so therefore the idea of people swinging the other way is actually something that is quite likely, but even if they don't, the other parties they go to are just smaller left-wing parties anyway, which just further splits the vote, which is what Miya already told you. So I think that Reform was already second in a lot of constituencies anyway, so therefore if these current dominant parties aren't the ones being voted for, the next logical step is for Reform to be the one that fills this gap anyway. And I think the first past the post just benefits whichever side is able to get the disillusioned and grey area voters that you can't currently access. I've already explained to you as to why Reform get these. I'll explain a bit later on, just explaining the current like social and political climate of the UK in 2025. So I think that Reform are just able to do this. And so I think that, as Alex already told you, they probably only need the 35 to 40% anyway. And I think this is probably just an achievable goal given like local patterns that are existing. They're reaching the tipping point of this happening. And I also think that it's important to recognise that it just amplifies the USP that Reform already has. Okay, second of all, on the credibility stuff, which Alex kind of talks about like how they don't have the capacity to be able to like run these campaigns in a successful way. I think that they do just have correct credibility, because what actually gives any form of party credibility is just visibility and momentum and the thought that they've got some form of movement and some form of goal behind them. I think that Farage already has previous experience. He was able to lead UKIP into national prominence. They've had mass MEP success within the party. They've had success off the back of the Brexit campaign, and it all shows that he's like known and a tested leader. Doesn't mean that you have to support him as an individual, but it shows that the things that he wants to do, he does get done, for better or for worse. I think it's just something that voters optically care about, because they want the people that they're voting for to be doing the things they said they were going to do. Conservatives and Labours just haven't done this for people. I think this is what Reform are actually able to do. And I also think that the structure that they have just means they have the capacity to be able to fuel a good campaign. So Mia's already told you as to why they have the money, but I think the internal structures and the ability to build those up, which they've already had, plus the fact that they'll have another 3 or 4 years to be able to do that, means they do have the internal structure to be able to shoulder a good campaign. And they also just have local and national experience in politics as well. So I think the threshold for credibility is just some form of viable alternative that people feel as though they can buy into and feel as though they're going to be represented by. I think they gain policy legitimacy through things like media coverage on like economic reform, immigration and sovereignty and stuff like that, and I'll go on to explain this a bit later on. So I think that like the status of an outsider just means that you're more credible when the system that you're in is lacking trust already, because you can be seen, because of all like the ideologically pure stuff that Mia already told you. And I think like Trump in 2016, he won on like this sort of authenticity campaign, whether you believe he's authentic or not, the people in America did. Second of all, Macron in 2017, he was able to create a new party and win from the outside. I think these are just examples of where this is empirically true. So I think Reform has the same vibe as this. Response number 3 about what I thought was going to potentially come out of opposition is the fact that this is like a protest vote or it's temporal anger and it's not something that's going to continue into the future. I don't think anger leads to a level of apathy in people. people. I think it just fuels turnout and mobilisation. If you buy all of Mia's stuff about the shy voter effect and the way that people are actually just going to mobilise when they see that the Reform are winning the polls, this just further exacerbates this because they feel vindicated in the anger that they felt. They feel as though the frustrations that they're feeling towards the government are being legitimised by the fact that the polls are showing that the party that they're supporting is the one that is in charge. Meaning they therefore they get into a cycle of the fact that the party they are supporting is the one that is going to be in power, so they just have an incentive to actually vote them in the first place. So I think it probably just means that any major realignment that exists probably does just come from like anti-status quo emotion that you can see is just empirically true, and I think that there is just sustained anger because of the identity politics tennis that is existing within politics in general. Okay, so two like kind of extensions on like first past the post advantaging Reform structurally, which is I've already flagged a little bit, but I'll talk about a little bit more, and then second of all about the actual like current social and political climate within the UK and why Reform actually just plays directly into it. So I think number one, why does like first past the post advantage them structurally? I think Reform as a party, it does just benefit from the triangular race that exists within UK politics. Because I think Mia's already told you as to why the left-wing vote is going to be, the anti-conservative vote is going to be split between Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, etc. Revolving door of like new left-wing parties, the cute ones like Your Party and things like that. There's just going to be a continual list of that. So even if you buy that young people are more like left-wing, which I'm going to explain to you why quite a lot of the young people aren't, but even if you buy that a lot of young people are left-wing, they're just going to further split between all of these new quirky, like new parties, like things like Corbyn and stuff like that. So I think that Reform are able to just consolidate any anti-Labour votes and any anti-elite votes. So the reason that Mia already gives you as to why Conservatives are just dead in the water to begin with. And I think that rise in general is exponential in terms of like the support and voter base. I do think Reform are reaching the tipping point where votes are going to be able to turn into seats, and once they hit that 25-30% margin, they do just become a challenger to hundreds of constituencies at the same time. I do think they have the capacity to do this with a slightly better campaign with the disillusionment of the two-party system that's currently existing. So I think this is the tipping point, and this is the reason why they are just going to be able to win the next election. Okay, let's talk about the actual geography of Reform voters. So even if you don't buy the quantity of Reform voters, the quality of Reform voters and the way that votes turn into seats massively falls in favour of Reform. So let's just talk about geography. They have massive clustered voting in key areas with lots of constituencies. Number one, they have high reform statistics within coastal cities all across the UK. Second of all, in the Midlands, there's massive working class populist regions such as Stoke, where I am from, where there's massive polling in favour of Reform. Third of all, the North East, where there's a rising anti-Labour sentiment, which used to be a consistent and consolidated Labour vote, is beginning to increase in anti-Labour sentiment. So geographically, these places are massive clusters of Reform voters in the future. So even if you don't buy that they're going to be mass on scale, the quantity and the way that this system works means it directly plays into the hands of Reform and the votes that they're able to get. And I think they play second in a lot of local results anyway, so it's logical that they're going to flow to first when these other parties fall. Okay, so what does the actual, and I also think that their vote actually just overlaps with the collapsing Tory margins that exist, which Mia already told you, and they also just waste fewer votes than Labour, because Labour might absolutely landslide win one constituency, but that actually isn't that important to them because votes just aren't the same thing as seats. Okay, what is the actual cultural and political climate of 2025? This is low-key the depressing part of my speech, but I actually just think it's all true. So, please listen. Okay, so I think number one, Mia's already explained the immigration, racism and spending stuff. I'm going to explain a couple of other things which I think just massively play into Reform ideology and party-like manifestos. Number one, I think a lot of people have distrust in institutions and current parties that are already in government or have already had sort of governmental experience. Look at post-Brexit fatigue and the fact that lots of people were reducing their voting turnout because they just felt completely disenfranchised with the fact that things weren't getting done. Second of all, there's mass economic stagnation. You're seeing it in the news, you're hearing all these sorts of things. Third of all, there's massive migrant pressures and things like that are existing within the UK. Voters therefore want some form of disruption, as continuity has failed them over and over and over again. When Alex tells you that you aren't already feeling the hit, you aren't already feeling the financial shocks of that, that's because we're in an incredibly privileged position to be sitting in a university debating society where we pay a shitload of money to go here, sorry Ava. And so I think that the vast majority of people are already feeling the shocks of this. I think for Alex to say that people don't feel that just shows the incredibly privileged position that he comes from and the minority of people that he's in. Okay, second of all, on populist waves, I've already given you a bunch of examples which they can deal with about these types of people. I think it just shows that outsider movements can become national powers. They do have the capacity to mobilise in this kind of way. Third of all, on social media, and I think this is incredibly important, I think social medias are able to bypass traditional gatekeepers that exist in terms of advertising. It's incredibly easy to do. It's direct communication. People can form parasocial relationships with these types of individuals. And it reinvigorates disillusionized voters. Note, next election, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. They're massively chronically online and they spend a lot of time on social media in these algorithms. And I think it's probably going to appeal to people who, number one, believe in a meme vote and think it's funny to vote vote for Farage. You heard a lot of people do that in the last election. They're more incentivized to do this when this party is legitimized to a greater extent. Number two, you have lots of people on alt-right take like pipelines, where Farage is talking about the fact that like you're damaging entrepreneurial spirit and stuff like that. So it massively feeds into the egos and the perceptions that these individuals already have. Third of all, they just have cute quirks. They have USPs. The fact that Farage is like an interesting looking guy and he's much more interesting than Starmer and anybody else that's going to exist means that on social media there's just massive levels of support for reform because they're able to push their stuff out on the algorithms to a greater extent. So even if you don't find Mia's stuff on funding, the stuff about social media is just low barrier to entry. It means that they do have the capacity to do this. Third of all, fourth of all, on generational angle. All voters are upset with Conservatives. They're going to want to vote for reform. Younger voters see reform as like more authentic and anti-party. I think it's just the perfect populist storm for reform to be able to win the next general election. I'm standing here right now. I am not somebody who supports reform at all in any capacity. To vote beside proposition tonight, you don't have to support reform. You don't have to support what they do. You don't have to support that they're going to do a good job when they're in politics. All you have to support is that the likely scenario for the average British person is that they see reform as an ideal out and an ideal person that is going to be able to support the things that they care about most in their life. For all those reasons, prop.
I thank the Speaker for their excellent address, and now we cross the floor once again and give the floor to the second opposition Speaker to conclude the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
When Jamie gave his 10 out of 10 perfect impression at the start of this debate, he has proven exactly why opposition wins this debate, which is that Reform is a populist party. This is something that government does not want to admit for the reasons that how a general election works. Something that Abbie actually touches on in her speech, but in the way that the UK takes its general elections, it heavily favors the establishment over a fringe party that Reform UK actually is. Okay, what am I going to run through in my speech? I'm going to run through 5 reasons why we beat Prop. Each one of them could win this debate. I'm going to run all of them. We undoubtedly win. Okay, what is the first one? It's kind of just expanding on how the electoral system works, showing you what it actually is instead of what Abbie has framed it to look like, and telling you how this helps like other parties that aren't Reform in general. First of all, the first past the post system, when you have multiple parties like this, as Abbie tells you, does not actually help Reform in any way. Why is this? This is because the vote is split between a lot more parties, which means that one establishment party that has already been in power is just easier to see as a voter. So if there's 15 parties now instead of 2, obviously an exaggeration, that are now votable, the one that has at least some established voter base is more likely to be able to take a win in the vote, because remember, you do not need to win the general vote, you need to win each single constituency. This is very beneficial to the established parties in this. This doesn't need to look like Labour, this could look like any of the parties that have some good amount of the vote. Okay, what does first past the post and constituencies actually look like though? This looks like the UK split into roughly even areas of about 73,000 people in which you don't need that much of the vote. This is something that everyone has talked about so far, but what does this actually look like for tactical voting, which is something that we're going to get into, and something that does happen. Okay, what is strategic or tactical voting? Why does it benefit the establishment? Why does it hurt Reform so much, and has hurt Reform already so much, that in a full general election they cannot win? Okay, so strategic voting is the act of voting, not for the party that I would most want, but instead for the party against the party that I least want. So if I am an SNP voter, and I don't want Labour to get in, and I'm sitting in a Tory seat, I vote Tory, I vote Tory instead of voting Labour, just to stop Labour getting in. So, what does this look like? This looks like people voting for any other party than Reform just to stop them getting in their seat, something we know has happened because in the by-elections that have occurred, which government has not mentioned because they don't look favourably upon Reform, people vote against Reform because it is such a disliked party. Now, listen, government has told you that Reform is well-liked by a small amount of the population. This is something they concede, which is about 13% at this point, according to the latest government polls. Notice they try to tell you this is all they need to win an election. This just isn't true, and they ignore an even more important statistic, which is about 50 to 60% feel incredibly negatively against reform. What does this mean? This means people are mobilized to actively vote against reform because it is so decisive in its politics. What does this actually look like? 3 things. This looks like its immigration policy being incredibly new and incredibly against the establishment. This is something that the general person does not like, but a small population loves. Something that has given reform huge volume and huge appearance, even though the amount of people are not actually there. It just looks like it because the people who care about it so much. What's the second reason? This looks like reforms blaming the establishment that has already existed, in which the majority of the population actually enjoy and actually like. Listen, when opposition tell you that things aren't good and the average person does suffer, this is true, but it is not enough to win a general election, and people will still strategically vote, wanting the establishment over anything else. The third thing this looks like is when reform is led by populist politicians, as I mentioned at the start of my speech, which are attached incredibly heavily to the idea of the party. So, when I am voting in my by-election, which noticed 73,000 people instead of the entire UK, I need to gain that exact, I need to campaign to that exact constituency instead of the entire country. So in these by-elections, which reform loses, by the way, they send Richard Tice or Nigel Farage to these by-elections to persuade the people there that they establish the idea of the party around these individual politicians. Note, they do not have a wide enough depth, they do not have a deep enough pool of politicians to go to in which each individual constituency they can pull this off. Why? Because there are hundreds of constituencies in which they need hundreds of MPs to be able to have said to win the general election. Okay. Why is the act of tactical voting likely to happen, and why does this help in the political landscape? I just think people are going to vote. It's more likely to go to a Lib Dem or to an established party that are already in because they have been in their area for years. So when government tried to tell you that the areas are changing parties, they will cherry pick perfect examples in which parties have left in which constituencies have left their average area. This obviously is picked up in the news, and this is why you have heard about it yourself. But what this actually looks like in Scotland, SNP are still going to win. In Wales, the Plaid Cymru, I'm so sorry on that pronunciation, wins in, what is it?
Plaid Cymru.
I'm not even going to try. Win in this area because people strategically vote for a party that establishes to their individual needs, and this looks like the 12 different parties in Ireland that I have listed, but I'm not even going to try reading. I don't want to. Yeah. Okay. What does reformed polling actually tell us in this, and how does government tell you this helps them when it just clearly doesn't? Okay, so governments have already told you that they are quite popular and that they have this high level of popularity against it, and then they also talk about UKIP, which is an important thing that they kind of go over and talk about positively. It just doesn't. So UKIP had very similar polling to Reform at the time that they were voted in, yet they got 1 seat in the totality of the general elections that they were in. Why is this? Why is it relevant now? Okay, so UKIP can have maybe a 14.3 vote in the total population, yet unless this is concentrated, Abbie tells you it is, she gives no reason why this is true, it's just not. And even if you buy it is in small amounts of seats, it is not in the entire country to again win a general election. So, when UKIP, or Reform now, have this high amount of voting overall, they suffer the same fate that Green has historically suffered, which is that the average person in a constituency doesn't feel this, and therefore they are not able to garner enough seats and win each individual constituency. Note, government want you to think of this as Reform is a steady increase. No, this just is not true, and just because they have rapidly increased, they are soon plateauing, and this is already happening. Why is this? This is from for all the reasons that they actually already tell you, which is they've got this meme vote, which they already had in this first election through all the mechanisms that they give you. This 16 to 17 vote just isn't as impactful as you think it is. Why? Because of voter ID that first you need to do, which has been introduced by the last Tory government. This means that 16 and 17-year-olds are just less likely to fulfill the burdens that they need to actually be able to vote in an election. This means that people just are a bit more apathetic to elections when it's happening. Why is this? This is because youths are generally just more like, you see that your vote as an individual matters less. People just generally care about this less and are less likely to interact with politics. You already see this as people from the 18 to 21 bracket vote considerably less than anyone else in an election. This just means that the 17 to 16s are even less likely. And actually, I don't even need to be theoretical about this. If you look at Scotland, the 16 to 17 is the smallest amount of people that vote for their age. So, what is the rest of my case? I said I'd give you 5 things, so I should probably follow through on that. The organizational weaknesses of reform are very important to the rest of the election and why they just cannot win. What does this mean? This just means that as a new party, they lack the huge amount of infrastructure, experience, and members and staff to be able to fulfill a win at a general election. Why is this? This is the populist party ideas that I've already told you, that Richard Tice and Nigel Farage cannot be in every constituency to win every debate. And to win every vote, we win every debate, Alex. What does this actually look like? This looks like them having random people who you've never heard about, or 16 to 17-year-olds in their constituencies who get voted in and then are mocked horrendously online and all this because they're not doing a good job. So the only reform people that we all know about are Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. When it comes to a random reform person, I don't care. But the establishment have MPs who have long been with their area, so even if it's not the voted in one, it just means that they have MPs who have been part of this area and who have at least been standing for MPs for a while. This is just more likely to connect to the average person. Okay, so the elections require a massive amount of staff, and I just think this is something that even if government can tell you that I'm wrong in my MP thing, wow, I need to keep going quickly. Even if they can prove that we're wrong, they just don't have this massive amount of staff and hundreds of years of like voter registration data and like private data that they collect in the party record. So the Tories and Labour and all of this know about the people in this, and I just beg you to vote opposition for all the reasons I've given. They're not right, and remember, an election is in 5 years.
For their excellent address, and indeed thank you to all the speakers for what has been a fantastic debate so far. So it is now time to open up the debate to the floor, which means we'll have short speeches from anyone in the audience. So if you'd like to give a speech, please raise your hand nice and high so that I can see it. Speeches can be up to, we'll go 1 minute in length, and I will bang my gavel continuously once your time has expired. And when I do so, please sit down. This week, the best floor speech, as decided by us, will receive a £15 voucher to the Criterion, although we forgot to fetch it, so we will have to provide that to you at another time, but we will do that. Also, we have minutes that stretch back over 200 years, and we would really like to be able to enter your name in the minutes along with a short description of your speech. So please do state your name nice and clearly so you can be part of the hundreds of years of UDS history. So do we have any speeches from the floor? We'll go right here.
Hello, my name is Joel Bradford, and I'd like to address some of the points made in the first speech by the proposition, which was about how if a party is winning, that means that the opposition tend to get disheartened and they lose activists, for example. I can speak as a Labour activist. I've knocked on doors, I've campaigned for Labour at the last election. I can tell you from my experience, if there's a threat of a far-right government about to take control, that would motivate me more than anything else to get out and campaign. I'd also just like to point out that there's been a lot of conversations about the current polling. 3 years is a very long time in politics, and I think over time we'll see that the reform councils that have been elected are failing. I don't know if anyone's seen the Zoom call videos, but it's pretty disastrous. And people will start to feel the improvements that Labour are bringing into people's lives. Thank you very much.
much. Do we have any other speeches? We probably have time for about 10 at most, so don't worry if you're on next.
Hi, my name is Lottie Wright. I am a Reform supporter. The first speech you said that they are labelled as racist and far right. I personally don't agree with you, and I also sorry, I'm a bit nervous. I also wanted to add on to the proposition something that you didn't highlight about immigrants. Yes, you highlighted immigrants, but you didn't highlight illegal immigrants, which is a massive factor into why Reform is becoming so popular. So there's been a vast uprise in illegal immigration, meaning that they're not here by clearance, they're here illegally, which means they're not accepted under the laws of the UK. Farage refers to this as an invasion, which in history is also referred to as an invasion when someone comes onto land where they are not accepted to be there. I also want to note that the majority of these illegal immigrants are men. They're not fleeing families from war, but immigrants who are coming to gain off the government. An example of this is pensioners who have recently lost their winter fuel allowance when Labour came into government. Has
Sorry, that's time.
Oh,
Sorry. Do we have any other speeches? I'll go here in the green.
Hello, I'm Tamlin Head from Minutes. So if Reform aren't going to win the next election for the oppositions, then who is? Like, I looked at the last poll and it showed that the Greens is second with 17% and then Labour and Conservatives at 16%. Like, could you see any of these parties coalescing to actually beat the Reform Party at the next election?
Thank you very much. Any further speeches? Yes.
Hi, for the minutes, my name is Matthew. Please don't bother with my last name, it's too long and hard to pronounce. So I think something that I would like to mention in defense of the proposition is the way voter mentality works within right wing and left wing. Currently, both sides are feeling that the big government parties are failing them. However, with the right wingers, there is a very clear party that helps and supports their ideology, which is reform. Whereas the left wing overall, I believe, as someone who is left wing myself, feels that most left-wing parties are more centrist than left-wing. And this does lead into political apathy, where most people feel like their votes won't represent them, so there's no point in voting. Because, oh, that's my own phone, sorry. Yeah, so as I was mentioning, most right-wing people, when they see that their main party doesn't represent them, they will be more incentivized to vote for reform because they do believe that they represent them, whereas the left-wingers don't actually have a party that fully represents them and are more likely to be apathetic and therefore not vote. Thank you.
Any further speeches from the floor? We'll go here.
Oh, that's me. Yeah. Right, I'm Ariel. 2 points. Firstly, to the question about what would an alternative government look like, I do think we are ignoring the fact that there has been a lot of interest from both the Lib Dems and the Labour in a coalition with each other, and that is something that should be noted. Second of all, my big concern, which I would like to see opposition answer, is what is the future of the right in Britain at this point, because we're seeing with the Conservative Party that a lot of people are becoming despondent towards them. They're unable to actually win any PR, and due to how Britain is structured, you're not likely to see these Tory voters go across to Lib Dem or Labour, so they're stuck between not voting and reform. I think we need to look more practically at what a PR campaign against reform would look like, because calling out for the language that a lot of us disagree with being used isn't actually changing people's voting mentality. I think that's what America, Argentina, and other nations are showing at the moment, which is the fact that angry far-right language and calling people anything from fascist or whatever under the sun isn't moving anyone away from what they vote. So I'd like to hear from opposition what they think would be the alternative, and also how they could see the right being remotivated to vote back for the establishment party if they do not see reform coming in. Thank you.
Any further speeches at the back?
Hi, my name is Ryan, and I want to start off by saying that given that we are over 3.5 years until the end of this parliamentary term, I think it's a bit early in the debate to start throwing in statements like reform is going to win the next general election, because there's a lot of volatility in the British electoral system, especially given the first past the post system, and especially the decline of Labour and Tory parties. And if we look at the case study of France last year, given that their two-round system is even more entrenching the establishment than our system, if they were able to mobilize with tactical voting to prevent the National Rally from coming to power, I don't think it's not a possibility that the same will happen in the next general election here in the UK. And finally, one thing I've not seen mentioned so far is the effect of local council elections, which run every year. And while they are a litmus test of current sentiment, and Reform did perform well last year, they are also a competency test for Reform to prove they're capable of governing, and that they are able of solving like local people's issues. The thing is, Reform, like many other populist parties, are popular because they're ideal against the establishment. They have no track record, their policies have not been shown so far to be jank and unworkable. And I think I've done an extra election around this difference.
With any further speeches? Yes, at the back.
Hi, I'm Rob. I do believe that Reform will win the next election, and it's simple. If you want to win an election in this day and age, you need to be able to control the media narrative. Farage has shown himself for years to be adept at this. If you just look at America, after the electoral success of Obama, Democrats have struggled for years to choose an effective leader who can communicate the narrative. By comparison, Trump has shown himself to get people's attention and get people listening through overly simplistic but eye-catching headlines. Now, there is no one in Labour, Keir Starmer or anyone behind him who is able to do this effectively. And there is no one in the alternative parties, Lib Dems, Greens or your party, who people will listen to and are able to communicate simple ideas. By contrast, Reform are doing this constantly, and that is why they get so much media attention, and that is why Donald Trump gets so much global media attention, and this is why our fear of Reform will continue to surge into the next election.
Do we have any further speeches from the floor? Yes.
William so I have a few questions for Proposition Bench. So a lot of the analysis we hear from Proposition is telling a story that is already being told. So in 2015, Nigel Farage, as Iain points out, was the head of UKIP. All of the things that then Miya described about campaign financing, the anti-establishment already existed. But then what happened, as the back said, is you started to have people having these positions of power, as we were already seeing, and then no longer can you claim to be anti-establishment. You now have to claim to be establishment, but significantly worse. So I have three questions for Proposition that you need to satisfy, or I will vote for Opposition Bench. The first is, why can they satisfy something that Nigel Farage could not do in the past instances in UKIP? As in, how can he maintain idealism whilst consistently having to back off aspects of racism and ineptitude? Secondly, why will the Conservatives and Labour not react aggressively as they did in 2015 to do so? And thirdly, and this is maybe now a question for Opposition Bench, is we lived in a time in 2015 where austerity was happening, where economic crises were happening, but Reform, in that case, that manifestation, UKIP, wasn't able to jump off the back of it. So why does Opposition Bench think this is going to be the same now? Or why does Proposition Bench think it's going to be inverse now? As in, why can they now jump on something that Nigel Farage has historically never been able to do? Those are three questions that need to be answered, or else Opposition Bench will win.
Do you have any further contributions from the floor? Excellent. Well, it's now time to bring the debate back to the dispatch boxes. Each bench will have a total of 10 minutes to give their replies. So without any further ado, I give the call to the Opposition Bench to give their reply. Hear, hear.
I'm back. I'm going to go through your floor speeches and then I'm going to go into the rest of my case that I got cut off so rudely from. William, you're my hero and he's smarter than me and still knows I'm right. They have to prove it. Okay, Rob, let's go into this media narrative because I just think this has been done for years already, as William actually points out. But on top of that, I kind of addressed this a bit in my speech, but in a general election, this populist party is at an intense disadvantage because the individual that people follow so much and this personality is just harder to find on the individual level anymore. So when you look at Trump or you look at Argentina, that people have talked about quite a lot, these are actually establishment parties, and they work in large-scale electoral cycles instead of the very small scale with many, many MPs that the UK has. So I just think on the UK system, it's more comparable to the European system, which actually, as one of the proposition speakers mentions, and I've forgotten which one now, a lot of these elections have just gone back into the establishment. So actually, whoever talked about Le Pen and stuff like this, Le Pen wasn't voted in for the same reasons that Farage just won't be, which is just people vote against who they hate at a certain point when they know all is lost. Like, they'd rather have someone that they minorly dislike than someone who they hate. Okay, Ryan, this 3 years thing away, incredible. Yes, it's just true. It's actually 4 years away. It could be longer than that until this election. So when they tell you about polling cycles and they tell you that 2024 was predicted, what they don't tell you is that 4 years before 2024, the Tories were doing mentally good, and actually they were predicted to gain seats in their next election. This just isn't something that is going to happen, I think, obviously, but it's just proof that their whole thing about polling numbers cannot relate to currently. This idea of, so Tamlin, who does win, I think the idea is just, we don't need to prove this. As in, if we can prove to you that reform won't win, it just means that unless government can tell you that reform won't win, I only have to give you reasons why this is true, that like they won't win, right? So the idea isn't Labour will win, this House believes Labour will win the next election, it's just reform won't win the next election, right? And Joel, yeah, you're also on the kind of 4 years away thing, just true, which is like, so I'll explain more about this in my last point. But on top of this, just voters campaign against like high numbers. This goes right into what I was saying about like tactical voting and things, is when people know that they're cooked, they're gonna vote against reform. Again, like I said, the polling backs me up in this. Is just like, people really don't like reform, and government need to address this in their speech. Okay, let's go into my last case, which is just, why does the electoral system, why is the organizational weaknesses of reform, again, just backing this up? I think there's a few reasons why this, which is just like the massive amounts of staff that these elections require means that even if there's 4 years, and government are going to try and flip this on you, that like because they're 4 years away, this is going to mean that they have the time to build up an electoral cycle in this. This just doesn't interact with the fact that like Labour, Lib Dems, Tory, all these established parties have like decades upon decades upon decades of each individual constituency, which they have then digitized and been able to bring into each vote so that they know exactly how to play each constituency. Again, reform, even when it comes to by-elections, are left kind of clueless on what to do in each constituency instead of just at a general cycle. As in, they can mobilize a population to go on a march for Tommy Robinson, but when it actually comes to what does an individual constituency want, reform don't get this. Okay, my last point is just coalition governments, and I want to go into this because Ariel brings it up in her floor speech, which is just reform by definition are never going to form a coalition government because they perceive themselves as anti-establishment. So even if government want to go into the fact that like, yes, they're kind of anti-establishment and they frame themselves as this, like they are establishment first of all, and I think a lot of voters get this. Even if the voters who don't, reform are never going to create any form of coalition because this would be against them and like get rid of their main voter base that believes them to be anti-establishment. On top of this, I just think there's the point that the originally established parties are likely to form a coalition, like Lib Dem, Labour, things like this, if they're in the face of existential crisis and losing against reform. Why is this? I just think these parties are willing to bend their policies enough to merge with another that forms some level of like ideological, that has some level of ideological like blending when it comes to politics, and they're able to merge their policies in some way so that they can at least get some level of their policies forward. Reform do not have this option, and therefore it just makes it even more likely again to win. So I'll remind you the 5 reasons why government wins on top of Alex's case about economics. The first is just that the UK government system benefits them. The second is voters strategically vote against reform because they hate them. The third is the organizational weaknesses of the Reform Party do not help it. The fourth is the political landscape of the UK generally helps the voter base of the standard parties. And the fifth is a coalition government. This is the easiest opposition that debate has ever had. Vote opposition.
We can make that.
Sorry.
No, after all, Iain went through a lot of the floor speeches, so I won't have to. I feel I should start with my good friend Abbie. Abbie, it's not examples ping pong, it's comparative politics, a very, very well established academic practice. Now, the example that you mentioned, the examples that you mentioned are moot and they don't apply because Geert Wilders in the Netherlands his party only entered government in 2023 because, on the condition that he wouldn't be a member of the government and the PM would be a technocrat. Le Pen couldn't be further away from government if she was looking at through binoculars. And as for Meloni, it's not comparable because of the Italy's coalition system that do not transfer to the UK. Once again, the comparative, which derives also the metrics for the three crises, works with Greece because Greece has very similar electoral politics, and it's the exact same of a party from the fringe to government, all on its own. Okie dokie. Then, economy. I never said that the people are not feeling the sting. Definitely. But the UK had a 1.1 growth rate last year. We are talking about an economy with sustained negative growth rates and an unemployment rate of upwards of 15, 20, 25 at its peak %. It's a huge gap between feeling the sting and living in an environment where you will turn your back completely on the establishment. History has shown this time and again. Now, going on to, where are we going to go on to? We're going to go to the point that first past the post actually helps reforms with triangular politics that Abbie brought up. No. Why? Why? Because radical parties usually spoil the establishment party from their own spectrum, which means that in this case, unless reforms manage to garner upwards in a majority of constituencies, upwards of 40%, then you will get someone from either Labour or the Lib Dems. They're just more likely to win. Miya. Polling data, apart from the fact that polls in the UK are generally quite inaccurate, the shy voter effect, they are compared to other European countries. Sorry, I saw them giving themselves a funny look. It's a fact. If you compare polls, the accuracy of polls in the UK versus other European countries the last 2 decades, the difference is well and truly shocking. So, shy voter effect. Today it has been proven that the shy voter effect works for both anti-establishment and establishment parties just because of the crisis of faith in establishment parties. No one dares to say that they're a Tory today, but trust me, there's still quite a few left. Same for Labour or the Lib Dems in some areas. So I'm very sympathetic to the fact that they really want the shy voter effect to work on their effect, but alas, it actually works for ours just as well. And second of all, I will end on immigration, because immigration is the one crisis that reform is trying to peddle and convince all UK citizens that is the one big thing. Apart from the fact that net immigration in 2024 was just under 500,000, so you see we're very far away from people feeling said crisis in their very daily lives, the vast majority. We've seen this before with the Notting Hill riots in the 1950s, well, we've not seen it, but we know it happened. And then other grumbles about immigration in the 60s and 70s. Neither Oswald Mosley in the 50s managed to make a comeback, despite, trust me, a lot of rambling and anxiety that his party, new party, was going to succeed, nor Enoch Powell managed to get anywhere. Now, final point, very quickly. Miya said about raising taxes, which will drive people towards reform. Capital gains and inheritance tax said that you said that we're going to be the ones to rise. The capital gains tax hit the upper classes. Mostly upper classes do not move the electoral needles. And finally, inheritance tax, which does hit the upper class, really. In cases without sustained economic crisis, it has been proven that inheritance tax is not, and again, enough to move the needle. Quite frankly, the fact whether reform is going to win or not has nothing to do with optimism, pessimism, or anything of the like. It's European Politics 101.
speakers for their excellent reply and invite the proposition bench to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
Oh, we'll just split the time however much I take. I will take the rest. I wouldn't talk for too long. Right, a lot to do in this speech. Let's start off by responding to Iain. Iain gives you reasons as to why people are going to default to establishment parties. Let's not be lazy. We cannot rely on outdated assumptions about how the British political system is going to work. We see political shifts happen all the time across the course of history. We used to have the Whigs and the Tories, then World War II happened, we fundamentally changed the political system. I would argue that situations like the re-emergence of war on mainland Europe, or COVID and the fallout against establishment parties, is enough to shift the needle such that we probably are likely to see a significant swing against establishment parties. Second thing that Iain says is that people are going to just hate reform and are going to vote against it. I have 4 things to say here. Firstly, see the responses in my previous speech about how the Overton window shifting means that there's likely to be a sustained move towards reform. As in, the fact that other establishment parties are now trying to adopt the language of reform means that individuals can see that this is just the norm within British politics, and thus again you default to efficiency rather than to who you blame for the particular problem. Secondly, he says the response to the idea that there's no apathy created because of the high voting for reform. This is just true insofar as individuals who see that there is a high level of voting against reform, maybe you don't stop the campaigners, but you do stop the voters. Third, and very importantly, reform have the money now to run highly sophisticated campaigns. So maybe it is the case that for a lot of individuals, reform's policies on immigration are alienating, but maybe to a lot of individuals, reform's policies on cutting net zero spending or cutting benefits are appealing. And because of all the reasons in my speech about why reform are the most able to access donations compared to every other party, they have the money to be able to do that targeted advertising. As in, they show adverts to the people who are anti-immigration about how reform is anti-immigration also, but they show adverts to individuals who care about spending on education, adverts about how they're going to cut frivolous spending and then be able to direct it towards this. So this means that reform are going to be able to run much more sophisticated campaigns than anyone else. Fourthly, see my analysis about the shy voter phenomenon. Alex tries to respond to this by saying oh, it exists for establishment politics as well. Yeah, okay, so maybe then the polls are just inefficient and you have to default to all the actual analysis provided in my speech about why people like the policies of reform, why the vote is going to be split in ways that are advantageous to reform winning. So yes, we can play example tennis all we want, but the analysis came from first proposition. Let's then respond to the idea that UKIP failed and reform are going to as well. The political landscape has just changed, the establishment has lost trust. But additionally, because of the Overton window things that I've said already, I know that I keep harping back to this, but it's incredibly important. It just does mean that individuals now have a fundamentally different conception of the political landscape than they did even 5 or 6 years ago. Then Iain says that the establishment have all of the MPs that have long-term commitment to their people. True, but this wasn't enough for all of the Conservatives who lost their seats in the last election despite having long-term histories of providing representation in particular communities. Let's then respond to Alex. Alex says, firstly, that all of the polling I reference is done by Farage sympathisers. Please don't insult my intelligence and suggest that I'm getting my information from irreputable sources. I quote MRP YouGov polls. This is information that we can trust for the reasons I give in my speech. Secondly, he says that there is a connection to Greek politics and a right-wing party that failed. Yeah, maybe this is true. Again, let's not engage with the example tennis anymore. Thirdly, he says that there isn't a political crisis and that the lights are still on. Yes, but the important thing here is that people perceive that there is one. As an individual, just perceive that the economy is bad because prices are really high. So it doesn't actually matter if the economy has grown by 1.1% when your school is failing or when you can't afford your groceries. You think there is a crisis and thus you move against the winds of political establishments. Additionally, just a lot of responses to things that happen in social context within Britain, things like attacks on migrant hotels, things like people's ability to blame immigrants for the issues that they see. All of this means that there is just a perfect storm that Abbie characterises as to why people move to reform. The final thing that Alex says in his second speech is that people only vote for right-wing populist parties when the economy is really bad. It doesn't make sense because people voted in Trump after Biden left an economy in a relatively good situation. So you can see that there are just many reasons as to why individuals choose to vote for populist parties that have nothing to do with the things that he says. Let's then respond quickly to William. Fine. Right. William asks me to explain why UKIP didn't poll so well, or why UKIP are not going to go, reform aren't going to go the same way as UKIP. 2 things here. Firstly, well, because the political landscape has shifted sufficient enough that individuals now have a very fundamentally different conception of what these parties look like. So maybe, yes, they thought that UKIP was a bit of a joke or they didn't want to vote for them. But now, for all the reasons in my speech about why the polling is so high, they see reform as legitimate. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. As soon as you see that reform are performing well at the polls, the donors flock there, the money goes there. But additionally, you as an individual just believe that other people are also doing it. And thus you have less of the social pushback which prevented people from voting from UKIP in the past. Additionally, he says, well, there's going to be pushback from other establishment parties. Yeah, maybe this is true, but follow the money. If these political parties aren't able to access the same level of donations that reform are able to, they might have all of the same incentives to do the pushback, but they just don't have the capacity. They can't run as effective campaigns against reform when reform is able to dominate the media landscape in the way that all teams in this debate have conceded that they're going to be able to. So yes, maybe the incentive still exists, but the capacity is much less person, and that is important. Let's then respond to Ian's stuff on why Reform just don't have enough of the establishment necessary to run the campaigns. Two things here. Firstly, they currently already have quite a large political structure. They have control of 10 local councils, 5 MPs, and a vote share of 14.3% at the last election, which means that they have a large number of experienced volunteers, which enables them to run a good campaign. The councillors of today are the candidates of tomorrow, and these individuals are going to be successful. William, this is not a contradiction. When I say that Reform can capitalise on being a new movement, I'm talking about the party that is attracting donations and setting policies. But this argument applies specifically to the individual candidates, as those individual candidates can now demonstrate that they have a level of experience, which makes them more likely to be voted in. But secondly, interestingly, because this comes up from the opposition, is that a bunch of Tories are just defecting to Reform. So you have a bunch of people now joining Reform, people like Andrew Jenkins, people like Lee Anderson, but also individuals who are likely to move to Reform over the next couple of years, who also have this level of political experience. Okay, quickly responding to some floor speeches. Firstly, responding to Joel on the idea that people who, when they see Reform are winning, campaign more. I want to thank you for the work that you do to undermine Reform by being an active campaigner. I don't think you're representative of the majority of individuals, insofar as you are actively engaged with the political landscape, which most people don't choose to do. Lottie, you tell me that I don't address illegal immigration, and you also tell me that I don't talk enough about how you don't agree with the notion that Reform's policies are racist. I thank you for sharing this opinion. I personally don't agree with the characterisation of immigration as an invasion to our country, but the fact that we are hearing the phrases of Nigel Farage being repeated in this House is evidence of how successful Reform has been in their political campaigning. As in, we hear it in this House, we hear it spread across the entirety of the British political landscape. This confirms all of the argumentation present in my speech about how effectively Reform are able to capture the hearts and minds of the population. Finally, responding to Ryan's speech about how there's a lot of volatility and how things are likely to change. The amount of time left is good for Reform because it's better for them to be able to do all of the large amounts of campaigning they now have the money to do. Additionally, to the point that Reform are going to mess up all their local councils, Reform are always going to be able to demonstrate that the failures in local councils were to do with central government's lack of funding. So they just say, well, we're going to get elected, cut frivolous spending, have more money for the councils, and thus we're likely to be more successful. That was messy, but it is clear from all of the speeches we've heard from today that Reform are going to win the next election. There is fundamentally nothing we can do about it. Oh my god, sorry.
I'd be embarrassed.
I am embarrassed.
You should be.
I'm going to leave.
How long's left?
3.5.
Mint. This will be quick. Oh, crikey. Going to be as quick as possible. Number one, explain the differences between now and then. Second of all, explain why tax voting doesn't work. Number three, on campaigning. Number one, on what the differences are between now and then and how this actually plays into the hands of Reform. Number one, we're facing a massive cost of living crisis, which means one of two things. Labour either increases taxes in order to be able to accommodate for this and piss off a bunch of Labour voters who feel as though this isn't something that they were going to do, or piss off a bunch of Conservatives who believe this isn't what we're going to do, and then they're going to go to Reform, or they don't raise taxes and it means that people are screwed over to a greater extent, which means they then feel as though they haven't been represented and supported by the Labour government that's in place. Either way, this cost of living crisis means that people are going to be quite upset. What does this mean on election day? Probably means that the things that are most proximate to them, i.e. the fact that they can't afford their weekly grocery shop, is something that they're going to care about when they go to the polls, which means that come election day, they're just going to go to the places that are going to give them these promises about the fact that if they remove immigrants or remove other things, this is how they're going to be able to pay for their future. Even if these are false promises, I just think this is how people are going to vote on election day. Second of all, which is massively different, is just we're in an age of social media that currently exists. I think this probably means that things are going to be memed and bitted. Look at Ed Davey on a jet ski, look at Theresa May dancing, look at Boris Johnson like ziplining and doing all these sorts of things. However, what are the difference in responses? When left-wing people see individuals who are in their parties doing this online, they feel as though they're much less forgiving about it. They desire accountability, they desire representation, and they desire these people to be authentic. So therefore they take politics more seriously and they're more like to buy out of this. However, right-wing voters are just much more forgiving of these types of things and find them humorous and engaging. See, on myself about young voters, even if there isn't a lot of them, there's still more of them, and there are still people who are existing who are going to turn out in this kind of way. They're much more forgiving, they're much more selfish, they're more like to think this is funny. And what's actually different is Labour has to now meet Reform there, because one of two things happens. They either don't make these social media campaigns and Reform takes a landslide of anybody who exists online, or they try and meet Reform there and they just don't have the capacity to do this due to the types of voters that exist. And they're also just able to do a bunch of fear-mongering tactics online. So this is what's actually different. Is number one is cost of living, second of all is the social media rage we live in, which Reform just has a massive monopoly over, and the types of voters that are existing are just more likely to forgive them on this. Second of all, on tactical voting. Tactical voting relies on people actually turning up to vote in the first instance, and if you buy all the stuff that Miya tells you about why people just buy out, tactical voting doesn't matter, because the people who are at the polling station are the ones who are actually important. However, I think the way that Ian characterises tactical voting is unfair. I think you still only vote within the side of political spectrum that you exist existed. Insofar as when you're a left-wing individual, taking Conservative on a ballot is something that's just incredibly upsetting for you, and you feel as though you've like gone against your own like personal compass and all these sorts of things. So you're probably just more likely to vote for the highest polling left-wing party that exists, as opposed to a right-wing party, just to do with the like optics and the fact that you feel incredibly guilty about doing this. So that means that left-wing votes are just split between a lot of choice. Young people go for Green in your party, rich people go for Lib Dem, normal or older people go for Labour. This is a split. Whereas a right-wing strategic vote is just for reform. They don't feel guilty about doing this. They're more likely to strategically vote, which means you do get the defected Conservative people. Last of all, on campaigning, dealing with Joel stuff. I think polls just embolden Reform supporters to do more anyway, because it legitimises the view that they have, gives an incentive to do this, and encourages grey area voters to buy into this. It means people are going to be learning more about reform. They're going to learn more about a variety of policies that they have, meaning that it's going to appeal to more people. They're going to have a greater level of buy-in into the party because they're aware of more campaigns. They're aware of more policy. They're aware of more things they do. Even if they disagree with the immigration stuff, there's probably a bunch of other stuff that they can do instead. Second of all, on the stuff about Conservative and Labour potentially working together or like trying to defeat the common enemy or whatever, I can't remember where this comes from. I think number one, it pisses off legacy supporters who feel as though they're being betrayed by either Conservatives or Labours. No, legacy supporters are the only people that opposition still have standing behind them. They're the ones they need to maintain. Second of all, I think it risks optics of these two parties converging and collapsing in and just becoming one sort of big party. Then Reform become the viable alternative and become the direct opposition and the direct backlash to this. So people are more likely to defect in this way. Third of all, I think it just means that they're fighting over the same pool of people, which is just going to split this vote even more, because even when they work together, they're still going to pick one or the other. So I don't think this is likely, but even if it does happen, there's forced to Reform. I think all these reasons Reform are just going to win the election next year. Thank you. 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, and indeed thank you to everybody for contributing to the fine debate this evening. It is now time to call the House to a vote. So, please raise your hand nice and high and keep it up if you side with the proposition that is that if you believe Reform UK will win the next general election.
That's not good. I'm gonna be honest, this wasn't coming up. Yeah, I thought this was gonna be close.
And if you side with the opposition, that is if you believe Reform UK will not win the next general election, and do we have any abstentions?
Liberals.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Before we announce the results of the debate, we will see if we have any announcements from the board. We've already heard about the ball. Is there anything else?
Just on the note of socials, there will not be a social this evening due to Friday night taking our just off the Union for decoration. So go forth into the rain, find beverages elsewhere, and continue this discussion next week. Or, follow me if you really fancy, but it's not connected to debate. I just have a problem.
Fantastic. Okay, so time to announce the results of the debate. The ayes to the right are 54, and the nays to the left are 27, with 8 abstentions. Therefore, the ayes have it, the ayes have it.